All right. And here come all the beautiful people. That's great. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Either you are online or you are in person, but today it is the start of the Region 1 conference for SPJ in Boston. For those of you who are in Boston, congratulations. You're there on a day that I hear is beautiful. So that's fantastic. For those of you joining us online, thank you so much for spending your Friday afternoon with us. My name is Israel Balderas. I am an SPJ member, a former board member of SPJ. I love the organization. I also am a professor at Elon University in North Carolina. I predominantly teach First Amendment law. I also teach ethics, and I am a former broadcast journalist. So as you can imagine, I get such a joy when I talk about the First Amendment, but today it's such a special day because I get to talk to the person that I think, number one, inspired me to be a defender of the First Amendment, and that is Nadine Strossen. Nadine, thank you so much for joining us today here at the Region 1 conference.
It's my honor to be able to speak with you, Izzy, as such a great advocate and teacher and practitioner of free speech, and to at least as importantly, to speak to such an important audience who really have the power to make free speech into a reality.
Well, as you know, it is the mission of SPJ not just to defend the First Amendment, Nadine, but to also educate the public about why it matters to have a free press and a free people. I know you've been doing this for a long time. I know you. You're my friend. You call me Izzy. But for those who, don't follow you as much as I follow you, you've been defending the First Amendment
For
since I
many
can remember,
decades.
for many decades. We'll just put it that way. But you are also the former president of the ACLU. Talk about, boy, the scars that you've had over the years defending the First Amendment to its fullest.
It is always the same challenge, Izzy, and I'm sure that you journalists face it as well, which is that most people believe in freedom of speech for me, but not for thee. And yet the test is always precisely when the speech is unpopular or controversial or dissenting. And what is a dissenting view in one community at one point in time can be exactly the opposite of what's a dissenting view elsewhere. So we have to remember what I think of as the golden rule of free speech. If we want freedom for the ideas that we love, then we must defend it for the ideas that we loathe. And we're facing really very, very big challenges now, all as is typical all across the ideological spectrum. There are different kinds of challenges, and people feel very, very strongly about these issues. And there are charges and countercharges of free speech, many violations, including in spaces where we would expect free speech to be most strongly protected, such as college campuses. Just in the last week, there have been egregious violations, but maybe your audience is more interested in talking specifically about the context of journalism. I'm happy to go wherever you think would be most useful.
Well, certainly when we were thinking about putting together this talk, this discussion, I had in mind that how do we educate reporters, journalists on the First Amendment as they prepare for one of the most consequential elections that I can remember, election 2024. We certainly want to inform journalists on what do they need to know when it comes to the First Amendment. But obviously, we're also journalists, Nadine, and we cannot not discuss what is happening on college campuses. We've seen in the news what happened with the arrest of almost 100, over 100 students, college students there on the campus. And we have a lot of college students attending today's Region 1 conference.
Oh, that's fantastic.
We love student journalists. So maybe again we can touch on everything that's going on because today is a busy day. But I do want to at least set the stage because of what you bring to the table, the discussion. First of all, you literally wrote the book on the First Amendment. This is like a must read in my class. This is a former book you wrote, Why We Should Hate Speech, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And then you just wrote a new book. I want to show it to everyone. So let me see if I can do this. I got an early copy, so I got lucky. I got to read this. But your new book is Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know. You know, it was very interesting to me, Nadine, that you dedicated your book to a beloved figure in First Amendment circles. That is
We're-
Salman Rushdie. Yeah, there you go. That's your copy. Um,
we're-
you dedicated the book to Salman Rushdie. I just saw Salman on 60 Minutes this Sunday, and I have to say, the people who defend the First Amendment, even at the cost of, in his case, right, injury and harm, they still talk about the First Amendment and the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech and individual expression freedoms. They talk with it with such passion. And I think that's what you do with your audience. You talk about it with such passion.
Well, thank you so much, Izzy. I feel that passion, and I think that too many people in this country take free speech for granted, which is wonderful. It's wonderful that they feel that mostly that their free speech rights are protected, but people tend to become much more passionate about free speech once their own ideas are subject to suppression. And one of the developments we've seen after October 7th is that since then, more views on the left end of the political spectrum have been subject to suppression, both by direct repressive restrictive measures by the universities themselves, including Columbia and Barnard, right around the corner from where I'm speaking to you right now. My husband's a Columbia professor. We live right down the street from where yesterday there were just masses of police cars and police and riot gear and students being arrested. So both direct restriction by the university officials and indeed by police and law enforcement, those were students who were expressing left-wing views. And then there also have been more so-called cancel culture pressures, a soft, indirect censorship when there's a lot of peer pressure, pressure from employers or potential employers saying we're not going to hire students who make statements about this conflict that are inconsistent with our own views. And in general, I mean, for every generalization, there's an exception, but in general, college campuses have tended toward the progressive end of the spectrum, and it's mostly been moderates or those on the right end of the spectrum on campus who have been complaining that it's about censorship of especially of cancel culture, and those on the left have been poo-pooing those concerns until recently when they have fallen afoul of them. So, I mean, all of us wish that the carnage that's been going on in the Middle East would not have come about. But if something positive is going to come out of this, I think it is and again, it's too high a price to pay. But you know, here for better or worse, the conflict is going on. One of the positive benefits is I think there's going to be a much more consistent concern about free speech for everybody, no matter what side of the debates you're on this particular issue or on any other issues. And I think, you know, the concern, Columbia's president testified before Congress a couple days ago, and the spectacle of members of Congress demanding reams of evidence and subjecting leaders of universities to cross-examination. Yes, I'm concerned about anti-Semitism, which was the topic of those hearings. I'm concerned about free speech, which was another topic. But academic freedom also consists of a certain amount of autonomy on the part of educational institutions, not to be beholden to political pressures. And these hearings, there's an inevitable amount of political grandstanding that's going on. So I would also urge people, regardless of what you think about the particular issues that are being discussed, keep in mind the specter of McCarthyism, the dangers of having university leaders who should be exercising their own academic freedom to make their own determinations about how best to pursue truth, which is the unique mission of a university, that we don't want them to be subject to too many political pressures.
You are also a fellow with the Fire. Certainly, it's an organization that has, in the last few years, sort of really ramp up, not just defending the First Amendment on college campuses, but really just nationally. Our friend Alex Maury, who works with you at the Fire, she posted this on Twitter the other day. She said, "These are the saddest days in the campus speech space. You never want to see police in riot gear descend on college student protesters. Yeah, we've got rules and laws and reasons, and it's complicated, but it didn't have to come to this. If admins, meaning if administrations, had been doing their jobs for the last decade, educating students about how to talk constructively across difference, teaching them their rights and responsibilities, modeling how we tolerate even divisive speech in our ideological diverse world, we might not have arrived here." Can you talk about that? Because you travel across the country. I think last year you spoke like some 220 times at different college campuses. What do you see and what do you hear? And what do you tell college students, faculty, administrators about the importance of the First Amendment?
Well, that's a great question, and it applies not only to campus audiences, but to every audience. I speak to journalists a lot, as you can imagine, including about particular controversies. And people always ask me, including journalists and people on campus, what is the single greatest threat to free speech today? And I always say it is lack of information, it is lack of understanding, it is lack of knowledge about free speech principles. That is the point that you're making. If people had understood, A, the importance of free speech, B, what it is, how broad its scope is, and yet it is not unlimited in scope, that there are certain types of expression that do cross the line and should be restricted because they interfere with other people's freedom of speech. And, ideally in a university setting, people would be informed of how vigorously they can exercise their free speech rights, but that there are limits. They may not engage in targeted harassment or hostile environment harassment or bullying or true threats, some of the and they may not violate content neutral time, place, and manner restrictions, such as areas of the campus that are off limits because they are dedicated to other purposes, including classrooms and laboratories and libraries where there have been and administrative buildings. If people understood what the limits are, understood that the limits are really fair and are designed to give maximum scope to speech, never allowing speech to be punished solely because of disapproval of what it says or disagreement with what it says, but if in a particular context it is disruptive, it interferes with other people's free speech rights, other people's freedom of movement, other people's privacy and safety, then it has to be restricted because there are free speech concerns on both sides of the balance here. And unfortunately, law enforcement has to be called in, and even university discipline has to be meted out only when education, which should be our first resort, hopefully it would be our last resort, but when that fails as a last resort, you have to call in the disciplinary measures. And I really did relate to the president of Columbia when she said, "I didn't become the president of a university in order to punish students, but at this point I have no choice."
Columbia Journalism just posted this tweet. They wrote, "Columbia Journalism School is committed to a free press. If you are a credentialed member of the media and have been denied access to campus, please send us a DM." When you talk to student journalists, and we have several of them, I think over 100 here at Region 1, what do
Wonderful.
they need to know when it comes to covering this? When I look at something like this and I go, well, okay, credentialed member of the media, well, thank God you don't have to, under the First Amendment,
Exactly.
have a card, number one. So first I get a little troubled by it, but I also understand the situation here. And then for our student journalists, which SPJ has said this for years, student journalists have the same rights as professional journalists.
Absolutely.
There's no difference between the two. So what would you advise student journalists that are covering these very tumultuous issues? What do they need to know? And at the same time, what do they need to be careful about?
Well, you made 2 points about equality of rights here, Izzy, which many people don't know. So I think they really bear underscoring. Number one, student journalists have the same free speech rights as other journalists. And number two, every single member of our society has the same rights as a journalist. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press have been interpreted as extending the same broad scope of freedoms and the same limits on those freedoms. Repeatedly, the Supreme Court has been asked to carve out certain special rights for members of the media, and they are germane to the controversy that you're talking about, because the rights that have been sought have been special rights of access to government property that, for understandable reasons, is restricted, such as military operations, such as prisons, such as court proceedings when there are only limited numbers of spaces. And the Supreme Court has consistently held that you don't get any more rights of access than any other member of the public, even though, there's a compelling argument. I understand what journalists are saying. They're saying that we should act not for our own self-aggrandizement, but because of the essential role that we play in a free society to provide information to members of the public. And so it's important to note that in many circumstances, government has voluntarily given special access to members of the media that, as I understand, choose among themselves. So, for example, for a military operation, the government might say, to its credit, we can accommodate a certain number of members of the press pool so that they can serve the really important function of giving information to the public. Everybody understands that you can't allow everybody at that kind of access. And I understand journalists will have some process for choosing among themselves and rotating who would get that access. Likewise, in the United States Supreme Court, which is a very small courtroom physically, there are a certain number of seats that are set aside for journalists, and there's a process for people who specialize in covering the Supreme Court to rotate in getting access to those places. But basically, every single one of us has an implicit freedom to receive information and ideas, not only to convey information and ideas, and for that purpose, to have access certainly to government property. Now, Columbia University is a private campus. That means it is not bound by First Amendment guarantees. That said, Columbia, along with the vast majority of private higher education institutions, have said, as a voluntary matter, given our commitment to the pursuit of truth and to academic freedom and to the best possible teaching and research, we are voluntarily going to abide by the same free speech principles that we would be required to abide by were we a public campus. And in that situation, there may be content neutral restrictions on access to time, place, and manner access to certain buildings, certain facilities, but they may not be discriminatorily enforced based on the identity of the person, whether it's a student journalist or another journalist or a non-journalist. And they certainly may not be based on the viewpoint, whether you're chanting from the river to the sea or whether you're chanting something completely different. That's irrelevant. That is never a justification for limiting your free speech rights.
Talking about what's going on nationally, we all reporters know that election 2024 is looming. We've got already the candidates, crisscrossing, and we also have one candidate that is facing a criminal trial. And so certainly for journalists and political journalists that are covering the elections, it could be tumultuous, right? Where can you report? Where can you go? What can you do? What's the ethical thing to do? And so as you look at the elections 2024, just the broad picture, what are some of the things that journalists need to be aware of as they start covering, again, politics is now almost a full contact sport, whether it's the presidential coverage or the mayor's coverage? What is the things that you see over and over that journalists need to know in order for them to do their job?
Well, first, they have to have a sense of pride and a sense of responsibility, which I'm sure that most journalists have, because you're not going into this to make a lot of money in most cases. And I just can't stress enough how valued you are in carrying out your reportorial functions, that journalism has been described as the fourth branch of government. You know, we have the three major branches, or the three that are expressly recognized in the Constitution. And I guess the press is expressly recognized in the First Amendment. But presidents, starting early on, I remember Thomas Jefferson made a famous statement that if he had to choose between government without a free press or a free press without a government, it would be no contest, of course, a free press without a government. And we, the people, to quote the opening words in the Constitution, really depend on the press to give us the information and the ideas that we need in order to responsibly exercise our sovereign powers in this democratic republic. There's been a lot of controversy recently about you talked about journalistic ethics, Izzy. I mean, the fact that you have a right to say something, doesn't mean it is right to say it. And obviously, journalists are making choices every day about what they cover and how they cover it. Sadly, we see that public opinion polls show an enormous amount of distrust in the media, and growing amounts of distrust. By the way, as a law professor, I can say we see growing amounts of distrust on the part of the public with respect to academia, with respect to higher
Right.
education. Not to mention government itself. This is tragic. As a civil libertarian, I, of course, have a healthy skepticism toward government, toward all institutions. And I think as media literate, information literate people, we have to have a healthy skepticism toward everything we see or read. It's the only way to deal with massive amounts of misinformation and disinformation. But if the mistrust becomes so extreme that people are, feel they can't possibly know what the truth is, or they have to go off and read some conspiracy theories down some rabbit hole on the internet, that is obviously also really dangerous for democracy. So I would say that part of the democratic responsibility, with a small d, of the media, which is part of journalistic ethics, is acting in a way that will restore people's trust. To take one of the media outlets that I have been very supportive of, NPR has had a lot of very disquieting coverage recently. I'm taking this with a healthy dose of skepticism, because I haven't been able to fact check, but I've seen statements attributed to its new head about questioning the importance of the First Amendment. That raises alarm bells. I think everything is subject to question, but I would hope that important media institutions understand the importance of these principles. They're not perfect. Freedom of speech certainly can come with a lot of negative consequences. A lot of controversial, harmful speech gets out there. But the lesson we've learned from history, and including in this country, over and over and over again, and here I'm paraphrasing the United States Supreme Court, speech can do a lot of harm. But in our country, we have recognized that even more harm is done by empowering government to decide which speech is too dangerous, too harmful, too offensive, etc., too controversial, to let the public have access to it. Instead, we have to protect ourselves through that critical media literacy that I alluded to earlier.
You write in your book, no matter how much speech protection our laws might be, freedom of speech still will not be a vital reality unless we reinforce free speech with a free speech culture. And you sort of hinted at it right now, right? This idea of, is this about civil liberties versus civil rights? For the longest time, you said, look, it's not an and or an or, it's a both. And certainly, when you look at cases that the ACLU has defended historically, you look, for example, at the Skokie case, where the ACLU defended the right of Nazis to march downtown of a city that was predominantly Jewish. Their argument was, we must defend this right because we want to defend another type of marchers down in South in Alabama with Martin Luther King, because if the government says no to one, they will say no to the other. Can you talk about this? I think because I've heard you say this time and time again. We can have both civil rights and civil liberties, and we must embrace that idea that it's not an and or an or, but it's a both.
Absolutely, Izzy. You literally cannot have any other human rights, including equal rights, racial justice, women's rights, you name it. You can't promote any other cause without freedom of speech. And by definition, it is precisely the individuals who lack political power, either because they are ethnic or racial or religious or other kinds of minority groups, demographic minority groups, or because they are dissidents, they're advocating change, they're protesting current policies. By definition, it is those minority groups who depend especially on the most robust First Amendment freedoms of speech and protest and assembly and petition. And that is how we have come closer toward our founding ideals of liberty and justice through all. It's been when what started as minority movements gradually persuaded people to adopt their positions. Now, the Skokie case is a very poignant one because the contrast is not just Alabama. It's very close to Skokie itself. At the very same time that the ACLU was defending the principle that government may not suppress a viewpoint solely because of disagreement, even loathing of the viewpoint. It was the Nazis' viewpoint that was loathed and generally feared in the Skokie context, but not too far away in another Chicago area suburb called Cicero, Illinois. A few years earlier, we had come to the defense of Martin Luther King Jr. to peacefully protest there. Cicero was described by Time magazine as Selma, Alabama, without the Southern accent. The politics were exactly the same. But, I don't have to quote myself. I can go all the way back to every champion of equal justice and racial justice throughout U.S. history. Let's start with Frederick Douglass, who was born into enslavement in 1818, escaped in 1838, was an incredibly eloquent abolitionist orator. And he said, slavery cannot abide free speech. 5 years of free speech would banish the auction block and break every chain in the South.
Mm.
And more recently, I think people have heard the statement from the famous great Congressman John Lewis, a great student advocate for civil rights before he became elected to Congress, who said, without freedom of speech, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. So that's another lesson that I'm constantly voicing on campus, and students and others have to look through whatever the particular message is that is the immediate beneficiary of freedom of speech, because I can guarantee that exactly the opposite message is going to be the beneficiary very soon and very close by.
We do have a student newsroom back in Boston covering the Region 1 conference, and we've got a student journalist, Nadine, who asked the following question via chat. She is a representative from the CCSU SPJ chapter on campus. Her name is Anaya Ponce. I hope I'm saying that name correctly, but she asked this question of you, Nadine. What ethical considerations should beginning journalists keep in mind when exercising their First Amendment rights, especially in sensitive situations? And I would add to that, this idea of harm, it's one of our principles, our ethical principles, that we should minimize harm. But when it comes to the First Amendment, sometimes speech can be seen as harmful. So how do you balance those considerations?
That there are certain kinds of harm that cannot be remedied through and should not be remedied by suppressing the speech. But let me start with, and so I don't, and those kinds of harms I don't think can be committed by journalists. So intentional incitement of imminent violence that's likely to happen imminently. I mentioned threats and bullying. That's generally not, that's done in face-to-face confrontations, not
Right.
through media. I think the main harm that can be committed by journalists through writing or, broadcasting, podcasting would be defamation or intellectual property infringement. But I think that's not what you and the questioner are
Right.
asking
I,
about.
I
So
think so.
you're talking about people are definitely subject to psychological and emotional harm when
Right.
they hear expression that is very upsetting. So, to take the example that the three presidents were grilled about in December, and to some extent the Colombia president more recently, many Jewish people and Israelis hear chants of "from the river to the sea" and other pro-Palestinian chants, as they hear it as advocating genocide. Even if it were express advocacy of genocide, that would still be constitutionally protected, because the Supreme, and so certainly journalists to factually report that certain statements that will make people very upset. And I don't mean to, words are kind of failing me because I don't mean to trivialize it. I know these are not only emotional and psychological injuries, but they often have physiological manifestations. So we have to prepare people to be resilient. They're going to hear ideas that are deeply upsetting and offensive. And in a free society, you've got to learn not to let those ideas adversely affect you. And interestingly enough, many social psychological experts, other mental health experts say that all of us can learn to withstand the slings and arrows. I can say I did that personally. I
Yeah.
could not have become ACLU president or state ACLU president if I were as, traumatized by negative, unfair criticism and hateful statements as I was before I attained that position.
Right.
Um,
And I was going to say, from my own personal experience, that I've been an advisor to campus newsrooms. I can think, for example, of a situation that happened a few years ago. I believe it was on the Yale campus where, students were protesting. There was a reporter there covering the protest. And then the protesters asked the journalists, well, don't take pictures of us, and, don't show our faces on video. And certainly when you're covering things of that nature, student journalists, if they are told, don't cover me, because if you cover me, then I might get suspended, I might get in trouble. The idea that we would self-censor because we want to be careful to others. Pen America, and I know the fire has said, look, if you are protesting, if a student journalist or a professional journalist is there, it is our right to record the scene. That's the truth. That's the fact. Um,
And I would also defend the right of people to choose to communicate anonymously or pseudonymously. But once they are out there in public, I'd say it's a responsibility of the journalists to make it public if they deem that it is newsworthy. I mean, as I was saying earlier, there's always a certain amount of selectivity in deciding what to cover and how to cover it. But your criteria should not be making determinations that are inconsistent with revealing the truth and, the full information as you understand it, and
right.
a full range of perspectives. I hope that you see that I'm using my favorite First Amendment mug here.
I need to get one of those so I can show it. I think I have the fire, because full disclosure, I'm a member of the fire. I donate money, so I just want to make sure I
And
donate to SPJ and to the fire.
I mean, these are nonpartisan organizations. I would hope that everybody who cares about free speech, regardless of what your views are on any political issue, would be supportive of these organizations.
For
Although,
sure.
interestingly enough, I guess professional journalists probably have some restrictions for the sake of the appearance of impartiality on what they can join.
Speaking of that, I've got Nick Hirsch on. He is a journalism professor at William Patterson University, and he asked the following, and I can understand where he's coming from, Nadine. He says, listen, when it comes to these very sensitive, controversial issues like Israel versus Palestine, they are intrinsically divisive. So he asked the following. I teach at a very diverse university. How
Mm.
do you suggest instructors like myself raise these important topics while avoiding classroom conflicts? And I have to say, certainly civil discourse is very important now, right? The exchange of ideas, sort of diversity of viewpoint, but this, the again, the pursuit of truth, that these are things that professors, faculty care about. How would you suggest they go about doing something that they know is what the purpose of academe is all about?
You know, Ruth Simmons, who was the first Black president of any Ivy League university, the first female president of Brown, way back in the early 90s, and her first convocation address at Brown, there were already discussions about the harm and discomfort and divisiveness. We think it's a new phenomenon, but it actually has been around for quite a while. And she said, she hated that kind of talk. And here's a discussion verbiage. And she said, for education at its best is the antithesis of comfort. So if you come here seeking comfort, then leave right now. But if you're here because you want to be a change agent in your college community and beyond after you leave college, then stay and engage with the difficult ideas. What I do, and Izzy, you can imagine teaching constitutional law, we're constantly teaching about the most fraught and divisive issues, and including abortion. FIRE's last survey, a very detailed survey done of almost 250 different campuses, together with College Pulse, which specializes in studying college students' attitudes, found that almost half of college students say that they cannot have a frank and candid conversation on their campus about abortion. So are you still with me, Izzy?
Yeah,
Oh,
absolutely. I'm
great,
showing,
great,
I'm
great.
showing,
Oh,
sorry,
sorry.
as you
Oh,
were
you're
talking,
showing that.
I,
Oh,
I'm
fabulous.
a visual person. I'm
Yeah,
still a
great. I
broadcast
love that.
journalist. So as you're
Thank you.
talking, I'm doing a
You're
voiceover.
showing. That's
Yeah,
fantastic.
exactly. Uh,
And so, you know, when we talk about abortion or any other issue in constitutional law, and I don't know what subject the questioner is teaching journalism, I think that the same technique could be used. I demand of the students that they be able to understand, articulate, and advocate all plausible perspectives on all issues. I don't ask them about their own viewpoints. That is not the purpose of the course. The purpose of the course is to stimulate their and enhance their ability to understand a range of perspectives. I think that's at least as important for journalists as it is for lawyers as a professional responsibility. And the second advantage of that approach is that it frees up the students from having to identify with a particular perspective. And, you know, it makes them, I think, more open-minded and receptive to re-examining whatever their own views are, but they don't have to share that in class. All
right.
they're sharing in class is this the best possible argument that can be made for this based on the evidence and the analysis. And I say, very good. Now give me the best possible argument for the opposite perspective.
Right. As you know, I'm a faculty member. I got to write law review articles. And so bear with me for just a moment because I want to make a point about this. I'm right now writing a law review article, Nadine, about the case of Kennedy versus Bremerton. This was a case that was decided a few years ago at the Supreme Court. It involved a football coach that was praying after a game at the 50-yard line. He'd been doing that for years. The school said, stop, or you're going to get fired. He was fired. He took his case to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, look, it was after the football game. He is a public employee. He's speaking on matters of public importance. And by the way, he also has freedom of religion. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is because I'm writing a paper saying, look, I think Kennedy versus Bremerton was a good case when it comes to the public employee speech doctrine, because, in another case called Garcetti versus Ceballos, the Supreme Court limited the public employee speech doctrine, limited how much public employees can speak. So I'm taking the argument, that actually Kennedy was good for the First Amendment. Now, why do I say that, Nadine? Because all the press about Kennedy versus Bremerton was on one side. It was negative. It was a bad case because it
Mhm.
involved religion. And so for me as a journalist, I defend the First Amendment no matter what. But oftentimes, Nadine, when I see cases coming out of the Supreme Court that obviously are about expanding the rights of the First Amendment, the
Mhm.
press seems to go the other way. That's a bad thing. And I'm curious if you could talk about why it's important that when we cover these cases of the First Amendment, that the side that we should be taking is the side that expands that right, not limits it.
Or at least that accurately describes what the case actually held. I think that in cases that I've followed, including that one, the journalists too often tend to do what you expect members of the public to do, and certainly politicians, which is to look at who was the winner in this case, who was the individual, what were they saying, what group did they belong to? That to me would be like saying, oh, the Nazis won the Skokie case. No, it was a very important First Amendment principle that was won in that case, which is at least as important to anti-Nazis. And so there are many people who are hostile to religious expression, at least in that context where they fear there might be a danger of violating the Establishment Clause, so-called separation of church and state. Putting that aside, and I think that's a very debatable, and you saw the majority and dissenting opinions characterized those facts very differently. It's a factual, intense dispute. But let's assume, for the sake of argument, that religious speech was promoted in this case. The underlying principles you're correctly saying, Issy, would allow an atheist teacher, or an atheist employee, or somebody with completely different religious beliefs to have the same government employee free speech rights. You're looking at the larger principle. There was another recent case that also just really took a beating in the press for similar reasons, and that was the web designer case, where people were looking at what was the particular message that this particular web designer said I should not be compelled by government to post a message. And it was a message that was endorsing marriage equality, which was inconsistent with her religious beliefs. But I and Floyd Abrams, a great First Amendment lawyer, and a few others who definitely support LGBTQ rights, and also support free speech rights, we took the position that it doesn't matter what the particular compelled message was in this case. It would have been dangerous to everybody, even with the opposite beliefs, if government had the power to force you to support a message that is antithetical to your beliefs. So, it's asking people to operate at a certain level of abstraction, to get beyond the particular individuals and the particular facts in the case, to look at the principles and to understand how they apply to very different situations.
It is 12:42. I want to be sensitive to the Region 1 folks that are there on the ground in Boston. I know they start in person at 1 o'clock. So I think we could do this, Nadine. With a few minutes that we have left, I don't know if you knew about this, but I'm going to be open with you right now, Nadine. I used to be a cheerleader in high school. I was.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And if you look and Google that, you'll see the picture of me in my cheerleading uniform. Anyway, I am still a cheerleader for the First Amendment. So I'm wondering if we could sort of do like a rah-rah, go get 'em journalist kind of
Yeah.
as we move into what's going to be a hard year. We're seeing it on campuses, in newsrooms. Our dear friend Erwin Chemerinsky over in Berkeley,
Oh my goodness.
a man that literally wrote the book on constitutional law, he finds himself in troubling situations. What is the message as like a cheerleader? You and I, we're going to cheer our way into 2024. What do you tell journalists, the defenders, the frontline people that are waving the Constitution that say, look, a free press means a free people, right? A free press means strong democracy. What are the words you leave for Region 1 attendees to say what you do matters?
What you do matters, because no matter what is important to you as an individual, no matter what is important to each individual member of your audience, whether they realize it or not, they absolutely depend upon the information and the ideas that you are making available to them. You are, as Izzy, the words front lines are the best words. You are the front lines and the implementers of not only freedom of speech, but also equality, in terms of equality of access to information and ideas, to justice and democracy. I cannot thank you enough for doing your work, and I hope you feel the enormous sense of pride that you should, and also the joy that you should have in really breathing life into what, for most of our history, were just empty words on a piece of paper, or, as James Madison said, a piece of parchment. You are breathing real life into freedom of speech, and therefore into democracy.
Thank you so much. You are amazing. Again, you're one of my heroes, Nadine, because
Right back
you.
at you. I'm going to look up that picture as soon as I get off
uh,
this call.
and by the way, I still have the same hair, Nadine. I still have the same hair. Well, thank you so much for spending your Friday with us, Nadine. Again, you follow Nadine videos on YouTube. You learn so much. I'm constantly learning from her, but she literally now wrote the book on what you need to know about the First Amendment. Thank you so much, Nadine. And to those that are attending Region 1 conference, wow, you're about to have an amazing conference learning why it matters that what we do is so important in today's society. Again, tell a friend about SPJ, sign up for SPJ, be a part of SPJ, because we are defending what matters most, and that is a free press for a free people. All right, everybody, have a great time this weekend. Nadine, I will see you again, hopefully,
Look,
you know, in
look
this.
forward to it. Thank you
All
so
right,
much.
take care, my
Bye.
friend. All right, everybody, go have a great Region 1 conference. We'll see you next time.
Hmm.